as we go. This is going to be very demo heavy, so I expect a lot of questions.
All right, I have made you the presenter, so if you'll go ahead and get started, Mike, if you're ready. I can see your screen. Everyone have a wonderful webinar.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Just to confirm, can you see my let's get started? Sorry, it's PowerPoint. Yes. Everybody hates it.
Yes, we can.
You can? Okay, great. Thank you. So today is, this is part 1 of 3. Today we're going to be talking about building out your environment, literally getting started, setting up your Azure account, setting up your storage accounts, spinning up Azure cluster, HD Insight clusters, and moving data in and out and running Peg and Hive jobs, etc. Part 2 is beyond the basics, so we'll talk more about analytics, more complex data transformations, talk about some visualizations, that sort of thing. So it will build on what we've done. We'll introduce some new exercises that are considerably more complex than what we're going to do today. And then part 3, we'll talk about how to apply those analytics to business decisions. Primarily talking about questions you can ask your data, problems it can solve, and value it can bring to your enterprise. So today, again, we're working on Let's Get Started. I've got a few slides from previous presentation. I'm going to blaze through them really quickly because I really don't want to torture you with that. And
Mike,
well,
we do have a question. Will these slides be made available?
Yes, of course. So the slide deck I will post on my website, iheartbigdata.com. It will take me probably overnight to get that up. I will also have, I'll talk about this more at the end of the presentation, but I have a Visual Studio project that has all of my PowerShell scripts in it and links to where all the queries and such came from that I will also post out there. So everything that you see today you should be able to reproduce. So no, you don't need to take a whole lot of notes, and everything will be available, but it will take me overnight to get that up. So let's dive in. So big data real quick. What is it? Why now? Why isn't everyone investing? Based on the 3% out of the current 212, or a few less than that, that's only 6 people or something that it's actually a principal job. I personally am a little shocked at why the uptake of big data isn't more rapid than it is. But we'll talk about that very briefly. So what is it? Why now? Why isn't everybody investing? So what is it? Well, it's a little different animal than used to be. We've added all sorts of new and interesting types of data. Typically today it's described as a series of V's. You'll hear Gartner and everybody else talking, V this, V that. So here's our V's: volume, velocity, variety, and variability. So volume speaks to how much of it is, variety, how fast it's accumulating, velocity, how fast it's accumulating, variety. We have so many different types of data, all the way from the old log files to images and natural language files and such. It's variability. That's kind of a new one that has popped up here recently, but it speaks to the meaning of the data in the context that you're looking at it in. So it's one of the big reasons for the whole big data environment, and one of the real benefits is you load everything in and you keep everything. So today you may look at it and ask one question. Tomorrow you may have a whole different question to ask, and because you still have it all, you can get a solid answer without bias and prejudice. Other letters, I think there's 2 other things that don't get talked about nearly enough. One is advanced analytics. The other is certainly the value. So everybody's interested in big data, but until you can translate that data to something actionable and hopefully something that means something to a business, the value piece, it's really nothing but expensive, and I think that's a huge piece of why we don't see more investment in it than we have so far. So data sources now, traditional, there's a number of, talk briefly about where it's come from and how it's transitioning into from traditional to the new social data and such. So every business, most businesses have been collecting data for a very long time, as part of their ERP, CRM systems, etc., their financials. Surprisingly enough, I hear from solutions implementers that they use the words many businesses, most businesses actually, is a quote, are primitive, is also a quote, in their use of their data, which is truly shocking. It's kind of surprising when you see numbers. Gartner again publishing numbers. 60% of the world is invested in Hadoop of some sort, but yet you still hear that kind of talk from the people that are actually out in the weeds. Now, keep in mind, their clients are considerably smaller than the enormous businesses. They're the medium to small solutions implementers. Anyway, next, keep moving on. Machine sensor data. Machines have always created a lot of data, but we've never been able to connect them and collect it. So this area is enormous and is flooding us, and until we figure out what's important and what's not, we're going to hold on to everything. That's our propensity, has been ever since we started collecting data. So next, mobile device data. This is a really interesting area. We have now instrumented ourselves. The number of, you can see here, the number of mobile phones. This was as of last year. Almost 7 billion phones on the planet. We have entire populations or majorities of populations that have effectively put a chip in their neck and said, okay, we're going to voluntarily, maybe not knowingly, but we're going to voluntarily tell whoever is tracking this data what we're doing, where we go, how long we stay there, who we talk to. Tremendous amount of information is gleaned from that. And then we have, of course, the social media, Twitter, Facebook, blah, blah, blah. This is all pretty interesting from the standpoint of this is right now, very close to real time. We have never been able to do that on a broad scale, and certainly not across the entire planet, which is the next, tie that in with the historical credit and personal data that credit bureaus and such and banks have been hanging on to or collecting for years and years and years, and you have an unbelievably complete profile of huge portions of our populations, which is both interesting and a little frightening too. A lot of us don't think about, well, every time I go in a store and I stand around and I look at something, more than likely you're connected via Wi-Fi. Somebody is whether they are looking at your actual phone or just looking at the broadcast from your phone that's trying to connect. They know that there is an object with this ID in their environment and how long it's been there and where it's moving about in their in that environment. So it's whether you want to or not, unless you turn everything off, it's impossible to get out of this. That pulling the battery out is very true. So uses, we have new stuff. This is general big data. There's companies talking about, a company talking about being able to actually predict weather months into the future, which has never been, everybody likes to laugh at weather forecasters because they're always wrong, unless it happens to be raining and they say it is. Shopping patterns, really interesting article, and this is one of those frightening and interesting very much at the same time. So a father started getting all these pregnancy-related, baby-related solicitations in the mail from Target. He was a little irritated, so he marched over to the store, talked to the manager. The manager said, well, based on our data mining, we believe, we're fairly certain your daughter is pregnant, which indeed she was. So, you know, kind of frightening what they can ascertain just based on purchases and frequency between them. Target responded to his complaints by burying their targeted solicitations, their coupons and such, in with, you know, dishwasher soap and lawn products, whatever. They found that when they mixed them like that and hid them, that they were the actual baby item purchase coupons were more likely to get used. So that's the interesting and frightening side. I guess all of it's interesting and frightening. Anyway, civil conflict we have seen so many times, you know, over the last several years. We've got China locking things down, and you know, Russia is doing the same thing now. They're shutting down all the social media. I mean, it's crazy how giving people the means to organize and discuss and whatever it can change, you know, even governments, you know, boundaries and such. Healthcare, it's kind of going on long. I'm going to skip over. But anyway, if there's huge advances in healthcare, looking really at the event prediction, you know, who's going to have a problem next and what it's likely to be, and working with them to resolve their issues before they actually have that event. That's really that's the value of big data. Truly, we can look back at big data, our historical, and that really falls into reporting. You know, we can add some trend lines and do a little bit of forward-looking projections, but those go off target pretty quickly without including all the other factors that calculate into the behavior. And then we have the true analytics, where you're looking for clusters, things we didn't see, things we didn't know, and really discovering all the things that cause an event to happen versus this is the causation versus correlation in data science terms, what actually caused it, or what actually versus what looked like caused it. So why the hesitation to invest? Here's my thoughts. Return on investment. So it's the whole industry is maturing. All of the platforms are maturing. You know, obviously Microsoft's only been in this for, you know, a couple of years now, a little less than that actually. So capabilities, handing data around, you know, it's changing pretty rapidly, but it's really quite new. From some of the data scientist companies that I have talked to, there's a real problem with asking the right question and understanding whether the results are actually correct or not. If you read anything, and it's really boring reading, by the way, if you read anything on these algorithms and the people that are writing them, you know, from all the colleges and universities, engineering programs, that's the big deal, and everybody's still hunting around for the sweet spot. And the problem is there's no single sweet spot. It changes all the time. So what works in your set may not work in another set. So you really have to understand your data, and that's a problem. So resources, this really speaks to the issue. So two things. There's an immense shortage of skilled data scientists. You know, I'm seeing, just read it yesterday, that, you know, they're looking, you know, 200 to 300,000 for a qualified data scientist, you know, a year. That's pretty high, and there's well, bottom line is we're seeing, I think that's going to change. I think for anybody that wants to get into this, that doesn't have a data science degree, or doesn't have, you know, 4 years to go through a college program, if you've been through computer sciences and statistics, and, you know, maybe you can do it in a couple with your, you know, some machine learning classes, that sort of thing. But for the people like me, I do not have those degrees, some, but not all. There's an issue with I think there's a window of opportunity here to learn something about it, to take courses. I mentioned I'm in it's offered through Coursera, but it's produced by Johns Hopkins University, and it's a data science track. It's a total of 9 4-week courses with a capstone project on it, but getting into courses like that will teach you a lot. You know, there's so check out Coursera and edX. I'll mention those again later. So resources are missing, not enough people. I think there's an opportunity here, and that's truly why I'm doing this. So let's get started. Really, so enough talk. First thing up, we need to configure an environment. So we need to head out to Azure. I happen to have mine already up, but I'll open a new window and kind of show you what it looks like. So Azure, if you jump out there initially, you will go to Azure.Microsoft.com. No, that's not what I wanted. Okay, my account, sign in. For anybody that hasn't been there before, try it for free. They do have Microsoft has, let me back up for just a second. So there are several options for exploring big data and for building out a Hadoop based environment. Microsoft Azure is certainly one of them. It happens to be one of the more expensive. You do get a free trial. It lasts, you get a $200 credit for 30 days, and at the end of that 30 days, the $200, whatever you haven't used, goes away, and your account is, your free trial account is shut down. So you have the choice then of migrating that to a subscription. Now, the subscriptions are pretty reasonable. Storage, etc., is pretty cheap, but when you start processing data, they charge by the hour and they charge per core, and that adds up pretty quickly. So I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So anybody that hasn't been there before, you come here, try it for free. That'll take you to the sign in, and at that point, first thing you have to do is actually create an Azure account. And once you have the Azure account, it will then, it will then, I didn't really want to go back that far. It will then let you into your, so here we have our management portal, our options for management portal, usage and billing. So those are not my real numbers, those are somebody else's. So anyway, it will take you into your management portal. Management portal, you can then, come on, you can do it. It will show you everything you have built when you first come in here. There will be nothing here. So what I've done, I've created a number of storage accounts. Default directories spin up when you spin up a cluster. They're created by default. So something I need to talk about here, well, let's just go through this a little more. So other than creating the account, there isn't anything you need to do other than go through a process of exporting some publishing credentials and installing those on your local machine. So create an Azure account, and then we need to go look at other utilities that you'll need to install, one of which is Azure PowerShell. Grab the binaries. I don't know that I have that. I will put that in the resources document at the end of that I'll post on my site. Anyway, download Azure PowerShell, install that, and then there's a couple of queries you'll need to run. I'm going to pop this up and move it here real quick. There's a couple of PowerShell scripts you'll need to run. So probably a good time to talk about this. This is going to be very PowerShell intensive. For anybody that hasn't written any PowerShell, it's not that difficult. It's not that much fun either. What I've attempted to do is to go through and write scripts that will do everything and get them all working, and that's the project that I'll publish. So everything is also configuration file driven, so the name of your cluster, the name of your accounts, your secure passwords, etc., those are all taken care of in files. So the scripts that you'll find on my site are totally generic. There is nothing in them. Couple of exceptions. There's nothing in them that are specific to what I'm doing. There's certainly nothing relative to my accounts or whatever. You should be able to change the config file, store some passwords, and go for it. So again, don't freak out over the PowerShell, but if you're going to manage an Azure anything, you're really going to want some of it. Certainly if you're going to automate it, you will absolutely need it. So there are some limited interfaces. You can see some things, but you can't. It's difficult to do everything through the Azure browser. So part of configuring your environment, there's like I said, you have to export you have to get your account settings, Azure publish settings file, and store that on your machine, and then you go to PowerShell and you will upload that. Again, I'll have instructions on exactly how to do that, but it really is that simple. When you run the PowerShell command like get Azure publish settings file, it will actually prompt you for where you want to save it, and we'll write it there. So that's really pretty easy. So you'll need Microsoft, the Azure PowerShell interface. There's a couple other tools. Unlike most of Microsoft stuff, they have always been very good about creating user interfaces. They have really not done a lot of that here. So a lot of it is blind, and they even make references to in their own documentation about some of these third-party tools. The big deal, the biggest area I think is important is your file system, your HDFS, or your storage account explorer. So two of them that I've looked at. Not sure which one I'm not sure I'm sold on either one of them actually independently. But anyway, Cloudberry. It will remind you if you've done any work with any FTP clients. It looks exactly like that. So over here I'm connected to my cluster, my storage account rather, and over here this is my local machine. So if I want to move something from my local machine over to the HDFS file system, I just drag it over. Something interesting about the storage system, it's represented here as folders, but they're virtual. It's better seen probably in this browser, which, let me refresh this. So here, everything actually sits at the same level. These are really for organization purposes, and might as well be, they literally are part of the file name for all intents and purposes. They are not folders. Everything sits at the same level again. So here you have the Azure Storage Explorer. This is not a Microsoft product, third-party, Codeplex. Works pretty well. There are some nuances about it I don't really like. It's a little difficult to filter, a little difficult to find some things. Part of that was, well, it's not, I'm finding I need them both. This one is really easy to move stuff with. If you want to do it manually, it's literally drag and drop. If you want to, like in the case of this CSV file, if I want it over here and I want it in a folder, I really need to drag the entire folder. This needs to be in the folder structure that I want it to appear in over here, and then you drag the whole thing over. So it's kind of interesting. Anyway, I'm finding I need both of the utilities, and so far I've been able to do what I want. So let's see. Well, the biggie, we'll go back to Visual Studio, is of course Visual Studio. So here, this is I'm running 2012, and there's a couple of extensions, or one extension that needs to be added in PowerShell tools for Visual Studio. That gives you, native support for and some IntelliSense. Not a lot. It's pretty weak in my mind. But I haven't found third-party PowerShell interfaces that environments that will actually provide the where I can install the Azure SDK, and that's what gives me access to all the IntelliSense and all the commandos. So again, PowerShell looks a little scary, but it's really not too bad. So if we want to set up our environment, like I said, we have to install all these utilities. We do have to go to PowerShell, and over here we need to run we have to export our publishing credentials to our machine, and we have to import them into Windows PowerShell, and at that point our environment is live. I will make one note here that so far I have to have my browser open. I haven't figured out how yet to close this, so that there's something that is going on in the background, something related to the count, the subscription, that I haven't discovered yet. So I'll work that out, and I'll post that to my site as soon as I get that done. So for now, I have to be signed into my account, and my credentials imported, the publishing file imported to PowerShell, and have the SDK installed, the extension here for Visual Studio, and at that point you're pretty much ready to go. So little security, where did I put it? Encrypt passwords. So I talked about storing credentials. Bring up the folder where I have all this stuff. So I have, can everybody see this? Is it too small? I can do this. So I have 2 configuration files out here and 2 credential files. So these credential files, those are, if you get back out of here and open that up. If I open that with Notepad, you can see, okay, so in here the username is exposed, but the password is not. So not much damage there if somebody gets a hold of this. The username is pretty standard. It can be anything you want. I have 2 accounts here, one for my HD Insight cluster, and I'm also using PowerShell to spin up a SQL server and add databases to it. So I have a separate login, separate account for that. In my configuration, this is what's being read in all of my scripts. This is my storage account name, SAN. This is the location where I want my cluster built. This is the name, so inside of an account, the next layer in the hierarchy is a container. And this is the name of the cluster I want built, HD Insight cluster. This is the number of nodes I want created. And this is the name of the subscription. So not a lot in there either, but again, if you change this, you can build these things with any names you want, put it anywhere you want. HD Insight they just popped up. You can build HD Insight clusters now in 3 more locations. There were 5 or 6 available. They just added 3 more in the last week or so. Something I should mention, all of these names, this is really kind of icky, all of these names have to be unique within the entire file system, within HD Insight for a cluster name, unique within the storage accounts. So you're going to wind up with some really bizarre, you're going to need some really bizarre names. So pick something that is replicatable and is likely to stay unique for a while. Any questions? Okay. So that's my config files. So the first thing here we need to actually create those credential files. So if you grab this and you drag it over here to PowerShell and we paste this in. So everybody work with command windows and used to, you can't hit paste in here. You have to just right click and it'll paste it in. You cannot use your mouse to move to a new position. You have to move back and forth in it and then do your editing. If you want to copy something, you need to highlight whatever it is you want to copy and hit return. There is no, right click and copy. If you want to run something again, you can use up and down arrows, so you can step back forward and back through through everything that you've entered in here. So we're going to, if we drop this in, get credential, so it pops up a prompt and it'll ask you for username and password. Be sure to write these down. You'll need those, and be sure when you create your Azure account that you keep track of all of your names for if you could manually create storage, if your Azure admin account, don't lose it because it's kind of hard to find. So here it'll prompt you for username, password, and once you're done with it, it writes it to, it stores it in this credential variable. So this is PowerShell, so setting this credential equal to the output of this PowerShell commandlet. And once you have that done, you can then use this and it will write it out to, I don't think I can expand that, no. It will write it out to wherever you tell it to. In this case, see Azure PowerShell config, Azure Cred, and it needs to be named credential. That's important. Oh, question?
Yes. Can you suggest other environments to learn besides Azure?
Absolutely. So Azure is built on, it's an extension of, it's another of Hortonworks distributions. It just happens to run on Windows. If you go to Hortonworks, they have an awesome sandbox that you can download. It's a virtual machine, runs on on almost any virtual host. I happen to like the Oracle VirtualBox, but I would go there, and I was going to suggest that at the end of this because we're going to run some pig and Hive queries, but we're going to run them from within PowerShell. I'm not really going to focus on that today. That's a huge project to learn that. But they have awesome tutorials, and it's all graphical user driven. So you can either use their interfaces and use their libraries and such, or you can do that from the Hadoop command window as well. So yes, absolutely.
Ashton has a question. Can you use the PowerShell ISE?
I'm not sure what ISE stands for. What's that stand for? Integrated something environment?
She said integrated scripting environment.
I'm not sure. I can't answer that. I have no. Want me to Google that real quick? I haven't attempted it. Let me put it that way. I did everything I could through Visual Studio trying to stick with Microsoft tools. So for if you're going to go with Hortonworks and not go with Azure, then there is a in the Hadoop console window you can fire up just like you do in Windows. You bring up the PowerShell prompt. You can bring up a Hive prompt and a pig prompt and such. So all that can be done through command windows there. I don't know. I don't know of any utilities that are really focused on they're graphical utilities that really are a good development environment for Hive or pig queries. I mean, it's very much, in my mind, trial and error. The best so far, and I was actually looking to see if I could find a way to connect the HD Insight graphical interface to an Azure HD Insight cluster. We'll still look at that and see if I can't work that out. Don't know if I can, but it's possible. So again, I think Microsoft has kind of fallen on the sword here, or should.
I believe Daniel Holt states that yes, you can as long as you have installed the Azure applets.
Okay.
Then another asker says that Mary says a bulleted checklist of what is being addressed in this webinar would help us to follow along. So far there are lots of moving parts involved in not only setting this up, but also in navigating through it, and we're just getting started. Was that available before the webinar?
It was not. It will be available after, and the recording as well will be available after. So if you want to follow back through, I hope to split this recording up into small pieces. So it'll be a short demo. If I can't split this one up, I'll do a new one. I'll split it up. So I'll walk you through setting up your Azure account. I'll walk you through using the Azure browser interface to create storage accounts and spin up clusters and such. I'll walk you through setting up all the utilities, Visual Studio and PowerShell and such. So we'll take the mystery out of that. That's really my goal here, is to leave you in a position where you can run any of this stuff and to provide you with enough of a template for all of these things that you can take it and kind of run with it. So, more questions?
No, I think that's it.
Okay. So yes, it's a little cumbersome to get everything configured. So your machine has the credentials and keys it needs to talk to the Azure environment. It's not that bad. You only have to do it once, and then you're pretty much done with it. So it's really not that terrible. Again, I'm trying to take the brain damage out of it for you. So we've gotten far enough. We're creating these credentials, these credential objects, and then we are writing those out to a file. We will then use those. So here you have, this is a script for spinning up an Azure cluster. So this also will create the storage accounts, everything else it needs. So here we're going out and we're reading. I'm going to blaze through this, so don't really try to follow along. You can look at it afterwards, but we don't. We only got 15 minutes left here, and we're not going to get too far. So it goes out. This goes out and reads the file. You can make this so it'll actually read from the command line. So if you want to run it from a batch file and schedule it via task scheduler, or if you want to run it from SSIS, you could execute these PS1 files. That's the file extension for PowerShell. You can do that in a variety of ways. I chose a file because I want to retain this. Because here I have a script to create a cluster. I have another one to remove the cluster, and I need the cluster name. So I'm using a file, so I have a place to retain that. Here it's reading the file in, loads the parameters based on position, getting date time. Here we're reading in our credential file and creating a credential object. Then we dive into this part of the script. It checks to see if the credentials exist. If they don't, it will run that credential, a get credential piece, and prompt you. Then we start looking for, make sure PowerShell is installed. We make sure we have a storage account, that we've read that in. It then uses command, let's go get storage account key. So yes, there's a lot of negotiation going on here to actually be able to fire up this cluster. So check for storage containers, because you can't actually create a cluster with a storage account. You have to have a child storage container. And then it looks to see if the cluster itself exists based on the name we wrote in our parameters, and then it actually creates it. So let me see which file. It takes about 10 minutes, maybe 15, for it to actually spin up a cluster. So I'm not actually going to run this. I guarantee you it works. I used it this morning again. But again, all of these scripts are available. They can be run in Visual Studio, out of Visual Studio. You can run from the command line. You can do them any way you want. So we have a script for spinning up a cluster by name, etc. We also have a script for shutting down the cluster. Here we only need the cluster name. So I've commented out everything else, and it checks to make sure it exists. If it does, then we remove the cluster. So if it's not exist here, if the cluster name is null, otherwise it removes the cluster by this name using the subscription ID, which we're actually picking up. That's the piece that requires, so far, me to be logged into my account. There's probably a way around that, and I'll work on that because I'd really like these to be totally automatable. So we've created a cluster, all well and good. This will create storage accounts as well. So that the container and the account and container, if they don't exist, it will create them and then build a cluster on top of that. And that then looks like what we're talking about here. So here's my cluster, and here's the storage account, and within that we have these two containers. This one was actually created by that script. This one I created manually. So something about the storage, and this is true of any environment, if you put data on the default storage account, it's going to disappear. You don't want to leave it there. So you can use it for processing whatever, but if you want something you need to retain, you need to put it on a named account or something other than the default. And storage is really cheap. When you take a cluster down, when you remove a cluster or just delete it, the default storage goes away. And that's kind of obviously a problem. So real quick, so you know, all items shows you everything you've got up. If I were to have hit that create cluster, you would see over here status. It would be spinning it up, shows you what's going on. Virtual machines, blah, blah, blah. I haven't done any of that. I have 3 storage accounts, 1 cluster. You know, I'm not using virtual machines, anything else, so I will show you the script here for this and maybe have time to fire it up. Actually, go ahead and run that so you can see it. So back to our scripts: create cluster, remove a cluster. I don't think I want to save any changes there, so okay. So let's go ahead and here, scripts to spin up a SQL database. I do have something in here I haven't added into the config file. You need to create a firewall rule to let your machine, and this should be specific to your IP address, to let your machine actually connect to your database. Other than that, there's nothing in here that needs to be modified. It all comes out of our config file again. We're using our other Azure, our SQL credential file. We need them both here. So this is more or less the same, actually somewhat more simple. It tells us where we're going to put it, the name of it. We have to spin up a server, and then we create a database both. So in theory, I should be able to run this. Oh no, I hate it when that happens. Well, I'm not going to try to debug it right now. I really do hate it when that happens. Make sure I didn't have something highlighted. Yes, I did. No, I didn't. Blah, 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 blah. Okay, I've got something that should be commented out or whatever. Bottom line, we would have been able to come over here and we would see that we have a new database. So you'd see a SQL database pop up over here. You can treat this database, you can connect to it with Management Studio, you can connect to it with Excel, as long as you're using Power Query. I happen to have one up, so you can connect to the file system. It is very much as you might expect. Power Query. So other sources, Azure HD Insight. Here we'll enter our blob storage account. Next screen will ask for an access key, and again I'll show you where to get that, so you can connect to your Azure database or your Azure storage, whatever you like. SSIS will use the native OLEDB provider to connect to your Azure database as well. So let's see, where are we? Go back to Visual Studio. So create a server. I have another script for removing a server. Same thing, it's going out and looking up the server name that we want to remove. I do have a for each loop in here, and you may or may not want that in there. In my messing around, I create one. You can't specify the name of the server, you can specify the name of the database. It creates a unique server name, so you don't know what it is necessarily if you've created several. And something you do not want to do with any of the Azure stuff is leave something up and running. You don't want to leave databases. The SQL servers are very expensive. You know, it's like $400 a month for a small machine. Goes up to pushing $2,000 a month. Well, it can go well past that. But you do not want to leave your HD Insight cluster up either, because you get charged by the hour that it's running. It isn't terribly expensive until you start processing, but again, processing is by core, and it uses a lot of cores. So this remove SQL Server and remove the HD Insight cluster are very important. So we have a script here for uploading files to the file system via, again, PowerShell. So I don't know if you noticed on the other most of the other scripts, I've included the links where this code came from. So I didn't write most of this. I've had to modify a lot of it somewhat extensively. This is almost all out of Microsoft's documentation. I stuck to their naming conventions, so here, container name, cluster name, etc. This matches their documentation, so it should make it far easier to follow along. And that's the intent. I'm trying to make this as easy as possible for you. So here, I do have a couple of parameters, variables in here. So here I'm specifying the file I want to upload, and here I'm specifying where I want to put it. So this one does have a couple of variables that I've hard-coded in here. Again, that could be read from a configuration file. This might be a better candidate for reading from the command line. I'll put an example of that in one of these. In fact, I might modify this one just to do that, just so it's done. Again, I'm not trying to make anybody learn PowerShell, but you kind of need to you need a way to manage all this stuff, and it's going to be difficult. Otherwise, you certainly, again, couldn't automate. So here we can upload data. We can run this Hive job. So here, same thing, we're reading in our parameters, getting our credential, and here we're actually creating a string, and this piece here is pretty important. So here, string format starts with the @ quote on its own line. This needs to be the last thing on the line. This needs to be last. And this again is right out of the Microsoft tutorial. So can I zoom in? Yes, I can. So this part this is actually our Hive query. So this is just a select statement. And so Hive, if you don't know, it actually projects a table structure onto the raw data. and makes it act like, makes it look like a two-dimensional tabular model that you're used to seeing. So the queries all look pretty similar in most cases to SQL Server or T-SQL. You know, it's really pretty simple that way. Again, this is all about, you know, projecting structure and making things look like tables. Within the Hadoop environment, it retains that structure. It can, let's put it that way, and makes it available to anything else that wants to look at a table. If you define a table in Hive, then Hive will store that, and you can access that same structure. That's not the case with Pig, which Pig appears to be a whole lot more, I don't know how to say it, you know, it's very different. It's foreign for sure. So here you have to tell it where to find things, how far, you know, levels it's talking about, you know, tracing and such, filtering. You have to give it a lot of information, but it takes this piece and you know, and obviously executes the whole thing, but the format for it is very different. What we're actually doing here is we're telling it that, oops, zoom again. Is that what we're after? Sorry, I can't see the message. So what this is actually doing is going out and reading this sample log file. This is a web server log file, and it's saying that it's going to read through this. It's going to look for their log level is what it's called in their group. Yeah, it's log level in there, and it's going to count the distinct occurrences, and it'll show us the distinct values and then a count of those, and then it dumps it out. So we'll do a whole lot more with Pig and Hive both when we get to the analytics side, you know, in the next webinar. So Pig job, blah blah blah, map reduce. Looks very much like some of the others. This one's actually going out. This is running. You have to create a jar file. That's a pretty complicated process, but basically you give it all the libraries and all the information it needs, including how, you know, the algorithms and such that you want to apply to a particular file, and it goes and runs it. But you have to save it as a jar file and then push it out to the HDFS file system, and then you can reference it and execute it. So it's saying I want to run this on this data. So that's a little more complicated process. I've been looking for libraries. I found some templates on some things, but I'll bring those up in the next webinar. So, well, SQL Server, upload, cluster management. We probably don't care about that today. We're going to run out of time. We've only got a couple minutes, but I did want to talk very briefly. If you're out messing around with Azure, they've got a new product in beta, the Azure Machine Learning, which is makes the advanced analytics somewhat mind-numbingly simple. It takes a lot of the brain damage out of it. It's all user interface driven. Where are we at? Machine learning. I have an environment spun up. So it's really pretty interesting. This is fairly new to me, but I will talk about it here a lot in the next webinar. So basically, you have a graphical interface for creating experiments. You can drag data over, drag these execution objects, these tasks, more or less like you're building it in SSIS, and write your, I mean, it's a drag and drop environment. And like I said, I've been in this R class, this R programming and data science class for months and months, and it's really quite difficult. This looks to make advanced analytics really accessible, but we'll talk about that a lot in the next webinar. Um,
Mike, we do
do we
have
have
a
more
question.
questions? I
Yes, we
think I
do
need
have
to
a
wrap it up
question.
in time. Okay,
Is it possible to
sure.
share the Visual Studio HD Insight demo app on PowerShell?
The Visual Studio HD Insight Power App. I'm not quite sure what you're referencing. I am putting this solution, the entire solution out, if that's what you're asking. Can you clarify for me, please?
That would be, the asker would be Anandita Basic.
An Indian, maybe?
She may have already left the room.
Okay. Well, like I said, my intent here is to take the brain damage out of it for everybody else. I've spent weeks and weeks putting, all this stuff together and thought I had everything working. I'll fix that little piece. But parameterizing it and making it easy for you to deal with. Again, it is all obviously PowerShell driven. You can do all this stuff through user interfaces, although they're pretty scarce in the Azure environment. I would guess that well, I'll check on that HDN Hortonworks interface and see, put a little more time into that and see if I could find a way to connect that up, because that would, I like graphical interfaces. They're kind of obnoxious sometimes, but in this case the brain damage level is high enough, it's worth the effort to see if I can make that happen. So I will put the slide deck out, I will put my notes out. You'll have a step-by-step how-to on each of these pieces. The Visual Studio project will, all of these PS files, the entire project, again, I'm running 2012, so you may have to create a new project and just import all the PS files. Those are version independent. Let me go into my next slides here. So two more, August 26th, 2 weeks from today. We'll do Beyond the Basics. We'll get into the analytics. Part 3 is a week after that. You can find me, all of my stuff, it'll be posted here, iheartbigdata.com, and you can certainly email me at mreid@iheartbigdata.com. I will have a blog out there as well for questions, and I expect to be updating these scripts and completing some new ones as I put the finish up the next webinar. If you want some of that in advance, let me know. I'll give you, I haven't decided yet whether I'm going to require an email address, but I'd kind of like to know. I'd appreciate it if you would sign up, and I'll keep you posted. I will not send solicitations. It would strictly be updates. I can't sell any of this because a lot of it is not mine. So, it's a Microsoft copyright for the most part. So I think that's it. More questions?
They'd like to know the blog address.
It'll be at the iheartbigdata.com. Just go to that site and I'll have a link up on that. I have to create a new page for this webinar and post all of this stuff, so there'll be a blog with that page.
All right. Everyone, we appreciate your attendance. Mike, we certainly appreciate your time and giving us a free webinar on Big Data Part 1 of 3. Let's get started. Everyone, there will be the recording available at the end of this.